Okay, everybody. Hope you're doing well. We are, of course, beginning the second of the five Chumashim, and there's an interesting observation that the Nitziv makes in his introduction to his commentary on Shemot, that each Chumash has a rabbinic name besides its conventional name. So Chumash Bereshis is called Sefer HaYashar, the Book of the Upright, because it is the book of the patriarchs and the matriarchs who are upright and righteous, and although the book of Genesis does not have a lot of halacha, there are only 3 commandments in Sefer Bereshis: the mitzvah of procreation, circumcision, brit milah, and gid hanashem, not eating the sciatic nerve because Yaakov's thigh was dislocated. But the book of Bereshis is to teach us about midos, character traits, sometimes in the negative, by looking at some of even the mistakes that were done. And therefore it is a book of Yashrut, at least to teach us how to be Yashar. And the Nitziv has a very big point, that it's not enough to keep the Torah, one must also strive to be a person of integrity and goodness, and that does not always correlate with ritual observance. That's Sefer Yashar. The name of Shemot I'll get to in a moment, because that's what we're going to talk about. Vayikra is called Torat Kohanim, the law of the priesthood, because it largely involves sacrifices. The book of Bamidbar actually goes the same as its English designation. It is called Chumash HaPikudim, the Chumash of census, the Chumash of numbers, because the Jews are counted both in the beginning of the book of Bamidbar and at the end. In the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, it is the generation that left Egypt that was counted. By the end of the book of Bamidbar, it is the generation of the new generation that survived the death of the spies. So actually the rabbinic name for Bamidbar is the book of counting, the book of numbers, the book of censai, which I assume is the plural of censuses, and the like. Sefer Devarim goes by the name Mishneh Torah, which means the repetition of the Torah, and actually that is also the translation of the Greek term Deuteronomy, which was the Septuagint's term for the rabbinic name Mishneh Torah. Deuteronomy means the second law, or the repetition of the law, based on the fact that although the book of Devarim has many new things, it's not all a repetition, but there's much review and the like. Remember, the whole book of Devarim was given the last week of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, and therefore he reviews many, many points, the history and some of the laws and the like. You may know, of course, I'm sure you do know, that the Rambam appropriated the term Mishneh Torah, and he named his own code of Jewish law Mishneh Torah, but with a little bit of a different meaning. The rabbinic term Mishneh Torah refers to the repetition of the Torah, the review of the Torah. The Rambam took it in a very literal way, the second Torah, by arguing that the Chumash is the Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah, and his code is a codification of the oral Torah, and therefore the Rambam said all of the principles of the oral law you can get, and the rulings you can get from my code. Now that unleashed a tremendous amount of controversy, because the Rambam was accused of wanting to get rid of the Talmud, basically, because the Talmud, as you know, never gives you a bottom line. The Talmud discusses, debates, argues. The Rambam said, listen, let's skip all the argument, let's skip all the discussion. I will just tell you what the final rule is. And the Rambam writes in the introduction of the Mishneh Torah, he writes it himself, all you need are the 5 books of Moses for the written Torah, and my code for the oral Torah, and that will give you the entire Torah.
Shulchan Aruch take care of that as well?
Well, the Shulchan Aruch was much, much later. The Rambam was the Shulchan Aruch that was before the Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam was written in the 1200s. Shulchan Aruch is from the 1500s. But yes, the Rambam was actually the first Shulchan Aruch, and actually much more complete than the Shulchan Aruch, because the Shulchan Aruch only covers laws that apply today. For example, the Shulchan Aruch does not cover the laws of sacrifices and temple service. The Rambam's code covers absolutely every single subject in the corpus of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, and the Jerusalem Talmud. Be it as it may, the Rambam wrote a follow-up letter saying he didn't mean that, but the truth is he probably did mean that, but he retracted in light of criticism, because the Rambam felt in some ways if you have the proper bottom line, you don't necessarily have to go through with all of the discussions, and that's still a debate that exists in the yeshiva world even today. Okay, be it as it may, these are the nicknames for 4 of the books. Sefer HaYashar for Bereshis, Toras Kohanim for Vayikra, Chumash HaPikudim for Bamidbar, and Mishnah Torah for Devarim. Fine. What name is given to the critical book of Exodus? Now, one could imagine a lot of good names. It could be called Sefer HaGeulah, the book of redemption. Sefer Matan Torah. I mean, a lot of good things happen in Exodus. Some bad things too, but we're not going to name the book after the bad things. So the name the Bahag gives, the Baal Hilchos Gedolos, one of the Gaonim gives to the book of Shemos, is, Shemos is given the name Chumash Hasheni, book 2. That's not much of a name. It has no name. In other words, Sefer HaYashar, book 2, Toras Kohanim, Chumash HaPikudim, Mishnah Torah. Why would that's the only thing it gets? I mean, Exodus is certainly deserving of much more than that. So the Nitziv explains that in reality, Sefer Shemos is really part 2 of Bereshis. It is Bereshis part 2. Because Chumash Bereshit is the book of creation. It involves both the creation of the world, the cosmos, the universe, and the creation of the Jewish people that are actually the purpose of the universe coming into existence in the first place. The second Rashi in Chumash quotes a Medrash. The Torah begins, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. Right, that's the translation. Rashi gives a drasha that the Bereshit, instead of meaning in the beginning, the base could be because, bishvil, because of those things that are denominated Reshit, the beginning, God created the world, and Rashi quotes various verses that 2 things are called Reshit, the beginning, the choices, so to speak, and that is the Torah and the Jewish people. And therefore, what the Torah is actually saying is, because of the Torah and because of the Jewish people, God created the world. God created the world so that there would be a nation that would be dedicated to carrying out His will in this way, and therefore the Avot are continuing the purpose for the creation of the world, and the Jewish people receiving God's Torah are really continuing that creation. And therefore, the book of Shemos is called Chumash Hasheni because it is really the culmination of the purpose of creation of the world. Now, in the book of Exodus, there are 3 major themes with a lot of detours. Theme 1 is leaving Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim. Theme 2 is Matan Torah, receiving the Torah. Theme 3 is building a Mishkan and to bring the glory of God into the camp. Right? Those are the 3 themes of the book of Bamidbar, with some the book of Shemos, with some detours such as the sin of the golden calf, which kind of backtracked us a little bit. Now, the centrality of the Exodus in Jewish life cannot be denied. Besides the fact that the Pesach Seder is certainly one of the top 3 ceremonies that virtually every Jew does observe, along with Yom Kippur and maybe lighting Hanukkah candles. But certainly going, we talk about the 3-day-a-year Jew, or the even the one. But if he's a 1-day-a-year Jew, that one day might very well be the Pesach Seder. Now, the Pesach Seder may be treif, it may not be kosher, it may not even be on Pesach. I remember discussing once, I was discussing a point when Rav Chaim Volozhin, who was a Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, wrote a critique of the Hasidic movement in the early years of Hasidus. And one of the critiques of the Hasidic movement was that because Hasidut elevated internal religious feeling over technicality of observance, there was a fear that by emphasizing subjective religious experience, you would demean or not follow the details of the halacha. Right? That was kind of a fear, and indeed that we actually see, not in the Hasidic movement, which actually became more conservative in time, but we see it in New Age spirituality, where sometimes there's a great impatience with halachic observance. Like, what's the difference if I read Shema at 9 or 10? What's the difference? Isn't the main point my being inspired? So Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who of course spoke from the perspective of the Vilna Gaon, who emphasized the primacy of halacha, actually gave a reductio ad absurdum of this. He says, let's say that you're very exhausted, you've been working hard for Pesach, and you're so tired by the time the Seder comes, you just want to go to sleep. So what if your feeling would be, Isn't the whole point of the Seder night to experience redemption, to have gratitude to God, to have an open heart? So I'll tell you what, the night of the Seder I'll go to sleep early, and tomorrow morning I'll have a great, great, wonderful, wonderful Seder. Now if the only point would be subjective feeling, maybe that makes sense. But if mitzvah is also about submission to the will of God, you got to do it the way God said. So I was giving this example to an audience once. So a woman actually raised her hand, and she said, yeah, we did that one year. We couldn't get the family together. They were not religious. We could not get the family together for Passover. So we actually made the Seder a week later, and it was the most wonderful Seder you could imagine. So it's interesting that what is a reductio ad absurdum in one generation actually becomes an actual norm in another generation. But whatever it is, even if halakhically it's totally no good, but Jews are connected very much to the idea of the Exodus. The Exodus of Egypt is a very, very powerful, formative experience of Jewish consciousness. And not only do we do it once a year, but every single day, right? You know this. Every single day there is a mitzvah to remember the Exodus of Egypt and to verbalize that Hashem took us out of Egypt morning and night. That is why in the third paragraph of the Shema, when you recite a verse, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, that is a special mitzvah. That is a mitzvah independent of the recitation of Shema. And that is a mitzvah called remembering the Exodus of Egypt. Now, what's interesting is that the Haggadah makes the point, and you'll remember this from Pesach, that remembering the Exodus is not just commemoration, it is actually re-experience. Each person must regard themselves as if they themselves were liberated from Egypt. This is taken from a Mishnah. Chayav Adam Liros es atzmo. Each person must view himself, herself as well, ki'ilu hu yatsa mitzrayim. Now the question becomes, and by the way, don't confuse this with an earlier idea expressed in the Haggadah, where if God wouldn't have taken our forefathers out, I might still have been a slave somehow. That's simply saying, I'm grateful for what happened to my ancestors because otherwise I wouldn't be where I am. That's not the same as saying, I have to envision as if I was a slave in Egypt and I was liberated.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is, in one case, you are grateful for what God did to somebody else because there are benefits that you're getting. The other is you have to regard the actual liberation as occurring to you. That is a different thing. Now the question becomes, what does that mean? I was not in Egypt, right? I was not a slave. I can be grateful for the fact that my ancestors were enslaved and God liberated them, but in what meaningful way can I actually say, I was a slave and I was liberated? Now, until recently, you could actually take a bus trip to Egypt. I don't know what the conditions are right now. I used to pass travel agency that said every day, daily buses going to Cairo. I think a few years ago, I even saw a Pesach advertisement. Come spend Pesach in Cairo. Wow. Unless the plan would be right after the Seder, walk out. So then you're really experiencing, the exodus of Egypt at night. But I think Cairo is a little far. Maybe at the Sinai might be good. You could cross over the border. Well, actually, it took our forefathers 40 years, so maybe that's not a problem. So I want to share with you two explanations. One is the Rambam's explanation, and one is a Hasidic explanation from the Baal Tanya. The Rambam looks at this as what you might call method acting. Again, I'm using obviously a modern term. If you remember, if you're familiar with method acting, Lee Strasberg and the like, Marlon Brando was the Talmud Muvak of Lee Strasberg. So method acting is kind of the idea that you put yourself in the moment. You contemplate and you imagine yourself in that situation because then you can feel the emotions of that experience. So here's what the Rambam says. Certainly, you were not a slave in Egypt. You were never in Egypt. You did not experience slavery. Your duty is to be grateful for what God did to our ancestors. But the problem is, since I may not really be aware of what it's like to be a slave, so I have to imagine. I have to imagine not having the freedom to go where I want to go. I have to imagine being beaten. I have to imagine my children, perhaps, God forbid, being thrown into the river. I have to imagine, as if it's happening to me, all of those different abuses, all of that suffering, all of that tribulation. Because when I get the emotions of feeling what it was like to be slaves, and then I contemplate the freedom that Hashem has given us, my heart is filled with gratitude in Hakarat HaTov. So the Chayav Adam Liros Esatzmo is not expressing a reality. I was not a slave in Egypt. I was not an Eved. But I need to make believe that I was, in order that I should feel gratitude for what in fact Hashem did to my ancestors, which benefit me right now. Right, so I'll call that a method acting type of the power of imagination, that you have to enlist the power of imagination to generate within your personality feelings of gratitude. That is what the Rambam says. The second interpretation is offered by the Baal HaTanya, and it's taken up in many, many Hasidic works after the Baal HaTanya. And he says the following. He says that you have to understand that Yetziat Mitzrayim is both a historical process and a metaphor at the same time. Now, the reason it's important to say both, because there is a lot of discussion, particularly among alternative movements in Judaism, where some claim the historical evidence for the Exodus is not entirely there, and they claim that the Exodus, God forbid, is a myth. Now, myth is actually it's not such a negative word as it sounds. Myth meaning to say it represents a metaphor for certain spiritual liberation from enslavement, and it does not refer to a literal historical experience. Now, believing Jews do reject that. Believing Jews do very much believe, as an article of faith, that there was an enslavement in Egypt. Although, as an aside, I don't want to get into the chronology too much, as an aside, the number of years of slavery was surprisingly shorter than you might imagine. Let me just make a little comment on that. On one hand, Hashem told Abraham that they would be strangers and slaves and persecuted for 400 years. Now, we already cut off 190 years right off the top, because we in fact were only in Egypt from the time that Yaakov came to Mitzrayim till the time that Moshe Rabbeinu took us out of Mitzrayim was only 210 years. And the first 190 years are counted from the birth of Yitzchak, who never left the land of Israel, but we counted from then because he was already treated like a stranger. He was harassed. So we've gone from 400 to 210. But even the 210, most of those years were not years of slavery or persecution. And I'll just give you one calculation to show you that. I'm not going to show you all the calculations. And that is, the Chumash itself says that the slavery did not begin until Yosef and all of his brothers died. It says, right, Yosef and... Now, we know that Yosef was 39 years old when Yaakov came to Mitzrayim. That's actually recorded in the Chumash. We know that Yosef died at the age of 110. So, Yosef died more than 70 years after they came to Mitzrayim. And Chazal teach us Yosef was the first of the brothers who died. And there were 11 other brothers who died after Yosef. So, of the 210, we absolutely know that the first 71 years were not years of slavery. And then you add extra years of the other Shvatim, etc. So it's been said that the actual slavery was approximately 90 years. Now, listen, even 1 year of slavery, 1 day of slavery could be very, very bad. But the slavery was shorter than we often assume, and the like. Now, but certainly it is an article of faith that this is a historical experience. But the Baal HaTanya says it is also metaphorical in the following way. The word Mitzrayim has a double meaning. Mitzrayim is the ancient empire of Egypt, not the modern Islamic State, but that ancient empire that was a world power that enslaved us. But the word Mitzrayim is also connected to Meitzar, which is boundary, blockage, something that constricts me. David HaMelech says in Tehillim, in the Psalms, Min ha-meitzar karati ka, I call out to God from the narrow, confining places. And David HaMelech asks Hashem, Anani b'merchav, give me an answer my prayers with expansiveness, release me from my imprisonment. So the Baal HaTanya and the Sfas Emes and Rav Tzadok, they all go with this approach, that Mitzrayim refers to the inner constrictions and limitations within a person that enslave them and disable them and limit them from connecting to God. And in that sense, every single person has their own inner Mitzrayim from which they have to journey. There is a Mitzrayim of arrogance, a Mitzrayim of gaiva, a Mitzrayim of selfishness, egotism, laziness, despair, lack of self-esteem. These are all our inner constrictions, the inability to love another or express affection, the inability to love yourself, even that aspect of it. So this is a Mitzrayim within us. And to paraphrase an old cigarette commercial that the older people might remember, it's easier to take the Jew out of Mitzrayim than it is to take Mitzrayim out of the Jew. So the Baal HaTanya says the following: when there was Yetziat Mitzrayim, that created a spiritual power in the world that enables me to be liberated from all of my limitations. So Yetziat Mitzrayim has two meanings that exist simultaneously. There is the historical exodus of the Jews from Egypt, and there is that spiritual power that was put into the world as a result of that exodus that enables me to be liberated and experience my own Yetziat Mitzrayim. So when the Haggadah says each person must regard himself as if they were taken out of Mitzrayim, it does not mean, the Baal HaTanya says, that I have to pretend that I was in the country called Egypt, and that while I was a slave to Paro, and I got liberated from that particular enslavement. But it means I have to latch on to the spiritual power of Yetziat Mitzrayim to be able to achieve a liberation from my own personal enslavements. And therefore, even at the Seder night, there are two storylines that are going on simultaneously. One is the national story of the Jewish people, which every parent has to tell his child, generation to generation, how we became a nation. But there's a second idiosyncratic narrative that is really a private and a personal one. How all of us, achieve a liberation, or can achieve. Remember, these are always potentialities. If we don't think about this, we don't work for this, it's not going to happen automatically. But we can achieve a liberation from our personal enslavers. If I could quote a little bit of an unlikely source, there was an actor, I'm not sure if he's still around, Mr. T, black actor. And this is probably the first year that, maybe you've heard Mr. T quoted. But Mr. T wears gold jewelry. Right? That's what he does. He wears gold jewelry around his neck. So somebody once asked him, why are you always wearing gold chains around your neck? So he said something that I thought was profound, maybe unintentionally profound, but it actually said something to me. He said he wants to emulate his ancestors who were brought to the United States from Africa. They wore chains and he wore chains. The only difference is they wore chains of iron around their legs, and he wears chains of gold around his neck, but he wants to connect to his ancestors. Now, I think there's a chiddush here. There's an insight here. What Mr. T is teaching us here is that a chain of gold around the neck can be every bit as enslaving as a chain of iron around the leg. You can be a slave to hedonism, to materialism, to the rat race, to power. Right? Some people's Yetzer Hara is power more than money, right? Some are money, some are power, right? You have two types of dishonest politicians. Some want honor and money, some want the covet without the money, some want the money without the covet, right? But whatever it would be, that gold chain can enslave you quite a lot. And this is the idea of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that it's a metaphor based on a historical event. The historical event brought a spiritual power into the world. Now, in reality, that power gets activated during Pesach time. But the reason I'm bringing it up now is that the commentaries tell us that during the Torah readings of these Parshiot, we experience the divine light in a smaller way, but similar to what you experience on Pesach itself. So this is a Zaman of Yetziah, leaving, exodus from our own limitations, if we latch onto it. That's why you may see, particularly in Yerushalayim, that many Hasidic communities have special prayers and slichos and special classes during these weeks. These are called the weeks of Shovavim, like you've seen Shovavim. Now Shovavim is really an acronym. Shin for the Parsha, Shemos, Va'era, Bo, B'Shalach, Yisro, Mishpatim. Shovavim. And for good order, some add Truma Tetzaveh, so they call it Shovavim Tats, but that's kind of a later addition. Shovavim was the original one. Now, Shovavim is an interesting pun. On one hand, it spells out in an abbreviated form the names of the Parshios. On the other hand, Shovavim kind of means a wild, wayward, like Shovev, a wild, wayward, uncontrollable delinquent. As if to say that this is the time that we can tame the Shovev within us. So in Hasidic communities, they have a big emphasis. Some people fast during this period of time. They say slichos. They work on things like tznios. There are extra review classes in the laws of Nida. All sorts of different things that go on with Shovavim. But the central core of the idea is that we can become liberated. In fact, in this sense, obviously as a mainstream yeshiva rabbi, I always have a little bit of natural suspicion towards what you might call countercultural aspects here. For example, there are different, in the States, I see Haggadot, civil rights Haggadah, different rights Haggadahs, anything, it's kind of, it's wrong, and halachically, there is a problem with it. Well, yeah, I don't want to, that already. Well, yeah, even that, you're correct. And although a lot of the applications are not acceptable as far as halacha is concerned, but the notion that the Pesach experience is not just about the particulars of the Exodus, but it is the striving for a liberation, but not so much political liberation, much more liberation of the soul and liberation of the spirit, is something that's very, very powerful. Again, this is rooted in Hasidus and in Kabbalah, that every person has their own Mitzrayim that they have to conquer. But without God's help, we're not going to be able to do it. And Yetziat Mitzrayim is that koach in the Bria, in the creation of the world, that gives me the psychic and spiritual strength to break down those boundaries. So I'll tell you an interesting custom. The largest Seder in the world, I'm not sure I get it because of different problems, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but it's in Kathmandu. In Nepal, Chabad has like a Seder for a few thousand people, which is pretty amazing because they don't use microphones or whatever it would be. But a lot of the people are Israelis that are traveling through. Israelis tend to be all sorts of places other than Israel itself. Because it's a little avant-garde, because obviously there aren't that many Charedim at the Kathmandu Seder, so they do things a little differently. And one of the customs they do is that when they have a mass burning of the chametz, which also represents arrogance, puffed up, gaiva. So they ask everybody, write on a piece of paper some midah that you would like to eradicate, some character trait that you would like to get rid of. And let's burn it with the chametz. Like my anger, my selfishness. Get rid of it with the chametz. And understand that biur chametz is all about that as well. And I think that that's actually quite beautiful, because that is really expressing what chametz is about, and that's expressing what Yetziat Mitzrayim is about, therefore that well. And let me go back, an ancestor of the Balatanya, besides being a very, very great person in his own right, obviously he was, also comes from a very, very illustrious family. The Baal HaTanya's great-great-great-grandfather was the Maharal of Baal Shem Tov, but I'm going before that was the Maharal of Prague. The Maharal of Prague has been granted honorary Hasidic membership. Although he was before the Baal Shem Tov, so he obviously was not part of the Hasidic movement, but they kind of adopted him. It's like adopting your grandfather. So the Maharal is considered to be a pre-Chassid Chassid. And the Maharal raises a very interesting question. And again, it's a very simple point. We know that the Jewish calendar is primarily a lunar calendar. It's based on the revolution. A month is defined as the revolution of the moon around the earth, which is approximately 29 and a half days. A lunar year, which is nothing more than 12 cycles of the moon, is approximately 354 days. Now we know that a solar year, which is the amount of time it takes the sun, I'm sorry, I was pre-Copernicus, the Earth to make one. Yeah, I believe in Copernicus. Some people don't, okay. But the amount of time that it takes the Earth to make one revolution around the sun, again, we can be approximate here, is around 365, right? So there's an 11-day differential between a lunar year and a solar year. Because of that, at any given year, the Jewish date will be 11 days earlier. So if one year Rosh Hashanah was September 15, then the next year it'll be September 4th, right? That's what's going to happen. So when people say Rosh Hashanah is early this year, right? So your response should be, why? I always thought it was the 1st of Tishrei, right? Rosh Hashanah is never early. It's the same date every year. But obviously what it means is it's early vis-a-vis the solar calendar. Now, why is that a problem? Because the Torah demands that Pesach be celebrated b'Chodesh HaAviv, in the spring. Now, without an adjustment, what's going to happen is Pesach is going to get earlier and earlier. So if year 1, it's April 15, year 2, it'll be April 4, and year 3 will be middle of March, and year 4 it'll be in February. So eventually it's going to be in the middle of the winter. That's a violation of the Torah's directive that it be b'Chodesh HaAviv. So because of this, the Jewish calendar works out a very intricate system that's 7 out of 19 years, on the average every 3 years, but 7 out of 19 years, we have a leap month that where the month that would have been Nisan, the month that would have been Pesach, we declare it to be the second month of Adar, and that pushes Pesach later into the year, making it in alignment with the solar spring, and then when it gets right early, push it forward. Early, push it forward, right? That's what you do. Unlike our friends across Highway 1 in East Jerusalem, the Islamic calendar, which is a pure lunar calendar without any solar adjustment, no intercalation, and that is why Ramadan, for example, based on their lunar date, can in fact be a rolling fast. It could be any time of year. Now, of course, I get that. If I would be a Muslim, I would much prefer Ramadan to be in the winter instead of falling in the summer. It's a shorter day and it's not as hot. So especially when most of the construction workers are Arab, and you really have Rahmanis that they're toiling in the hot summer day without water. But the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar with a solar adjustment to ensure that Pesach will always be in the spring season. Right? This is well known. This is not the Maharal. This is basic knowledge. But the Maharal raises a simple question. Why is that so important? After all, if we are commemorating a historical event that occurred on a certain date, then the only thing that matters is the date. The date of the Exodus was the 15th of Nisan. Why do I care if that happens to be April 15 or March 25 or February 1st? Let it be the winter. We are commemorating a date based on when it happens. And therefore, why is it important that we correlate it to the season? So here's what the Maharal says. This is really quite a powerful thought and something that we're not attuned to too much because we're such urban creatures, many of us. Maybe I should talk for myself, that we don't really respond to the natural cycles of the world. And he says the following. He says, if Pesach would just be commemorating what God did, then we would just follow the dates and, who cares about the season? But if Pesach is not simply commemorating an historical event, but if it's tapping into the power of liberation that God puts into the world at that time, to be liberated from my mitzarim, my limitations, then in a sense, the earth is going to give you a clue when those spiritual illuminations come in. Because let's take the change of the seasons. Winter. Winter is a period of dormancy. In effect, the fertility of the earth is locked up. Now, certainly, if you're in, let's say, the North America climate where you have snow on the ground, you see it. But the truth doesn't matter. Even here where the winters are not harsh, but obviously there are no leaves on the trees right now. There are no fruits that are coming out, meaning there is a koach there. There is a power of rejuvenation. But it's dormant. It is submerged. It is imprisoned. And what is spring? Spring represents the liberation of all of the potentials that were locked up in dormancy. So the concept is this. If we were to celebrate Pesach when it's not yet spring, we would be celebrating a historical commemorative event, but we would not be able to tap in to those spiritual forces because those forces aren't here yet. And the Maharal therefore anticipates what his great-grandson said later, that Pesach is about transcending limitations, and therefore I follow the earth. The earth is my guide. Now you may ask a question, well, wait a second here. What about the southern hemisphere? In the southern hemisphere we're observing Passover, and it is not spring at all. But the answer is that freedom comes into the world through Yerushalayim. So when it's spring here, this koach comes in, and then it goes south to Australia, and even if it's frozen by the time it gets there, but it's there. The koach comes into the world via Yerushalayim. Now I remember in the olden days, I think we mentioned this, in the olden days when people didn't have cell phones, so people used to use the old phone booths to daven mincha. If you were stuck in a bus terminal or a train station, so if you would be in the 1970s in Port Authority, 1983, even later than that, at Penn Station or Port Authority, and it was close to sunset, all of the payphones would be occupied by Jews who wanted to daven mincha, but they didn't want to be conspicuous, so they would have a conversation with God. But the point is hopefully God will accept the charges. I don't know. But at a minimum, it is a long distance call. Here, Baruch Hashem, it's local. You don't have to worry about all that. And indeed, although it's hard to describe the process mechanically, because obviously it's a spiritual process, but mechanically, the way prayer is described is when you pray in Chutz La'aretz, it's vertical, it's horizontal before it's vertical, meaning it got to cross the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and then it goes up. When it hits Yerushalayim, then the prayer goes up. It does not go up straight from Chutz La'aretz. It first has to arrive in Eretz Yisrael, and then it goes up. Here it goes straight up. So this is what the Maharal says. This is the key to why we are so concerned with the season, because the season tells me when these spiritual influences come into the world. Now, let's take it one step further. There is a halachic requirement in remembering the Exodus, or at least when we recount the Exodus at length, called Matchil Bignut Umisayem Bishvach. That means it's not enough to simply thank God for the good. You got to begin the story with remembering the bad, the negatives, the difficulty, the hardship. Right? That's why in the Pesach Seder we don't just emphasize God redeemed me. We talk about slavery, oppression, paganism, idolatry. Now again, let's focus on that. Why can't I just get to the good stuff? Right? Anyway, they used to say that what are the 4 questions at the Seder? When do we eat? When do we eat? When do we eat? That's okay. But the Seder takes a long time. Why do I have to go over the bad? So again, there are 2 answers I want to share with you. The first is a relatively common sense answer of the Rambam. And the Rambam says, it is the nature of human beings that we don't appreciate blessing until we contemplate what life was like without those blessings. We don't appreciate health sometimes until, chas v'shalom, a person was ill. You know, those of you that may have parents who came from Holocaust survivors or the like, you know, they tend to be, and they come to countries of freedom, whether it's the United States, Europe, or England, at least, where it used to be, or Eretz Israel. They will tend to be much more patriotic than people who were born in freedom. You're born in freedom, you take it for granted. You come from oppression. Every single step that you take, there's a tremendous amount of gratitude. Now, in a way, the Chovos HaLevavos actually writes, in a way, it's the opposite of what logic would dictate. Because if God was so good to me that I never even had the problem, I was born into freedom from the very beginning, then in theory, God's kindness has been greater for me than the person who spent 25 years in a difficult environment. Right? Nebuch, you had the good fortune not to have been in a concentration camp, so you're less grateful? Right? Nevertheless, it is simple, basic human nature that until we experience difficulties, we don't appreciate the good. So the Rambam says quite simply, again, it's a relatively simple, commonsensical idea, that if remembering the Exodus is about gratitude, is about thankfulness, it is about appreciation, then you have to remember and describe and relive all of the bad, because then you appreciate the good. Right? That's the way life is. You've got to appreciate the good from the bad. But there is a kasha on that. As logical as that is, and again, it's a perfectly good, sensible explanation, but there's a big question here. And that is, God is the very one who put me into the slavery to begin with. Meaning, if the pshat is, I'm enslaved by A, by X, and Y comes and liberates me, I'm going to be very, very grateful to Y. But imagine if somebody throws me into a jail cell and says, I'm leaving you here for 400 years. And then comes after 210 years and says, be grateful to me because I'm letting you out 190 years early. You might be upset. Well, why did you put me in to begin with? Now, the problem is, the slavery was decreed by God. Although we'll talk about in later weeks the issue of free will and God hardening Paro's heart. So the point is, remembering the slavery is not going to enhance my gratitude. If anything, remembering the slavery may make me angry at why God decreed that slavery. So, because of this, I think we're forced to understand the concept of beginning with the bad on a much deeper level. And again, this is from the Sfas Emes and Reb Tzadok. That the concept of remembering the bad is not simply to remember the bad as negative so that you appreciate the good, like before and after. But rather, on a deeper level, the bad is part of the good itself. Meaning, it's not that I'm grateful for the freedom, but in order to feel that gratitude, I got to remember the slavery. But rather, on some level, we're even grateful for the slavery itself. That is part of what we are grateful for. Because otherwise, you see, if all you're gaining by your freedom is you're back to where you were before, meaning I was free, I became a slave, now I'm free. Now, if freedom, slavery, freedom just means I was what I was, then I could rightfully be angry. Why did I have to be a slave in the middle? It must have been that the freedom that we got after slavery was different than what we had before, and the slavery itself was something that made us who we are in a positive way. So it's not a before and an after. It's part of the slavery is part of the redemption. How is that so? So I'll give you two. I'm giving a lot of pairs tonight. I'll give you two explanations for this. Explanation number one. There's a well-known chazal that says, Gemara in Sotah, the Medrash, that although the Jews in Egypt were spiritually very lowly. They worshipped idols, except for the tribe of Levi. They didn't do circumcision. They did not keep God's commandments. But they had certain merits. They kept their Jewish names. They didn't intermarry. They spoke Hebrew. It's interesting, speaking Hebrew. Think about the secular Israeli,
They wore black and white.
Huh?
They wore black and white.
Well, it doesn't say what they wore, but it says they did wear their Jewish clothing, whatever it was. I don't know if it was black and white in those days and the like. Which means, we would paraphrase it in short, that although they were not religious, they were not dati, but they had a sense of Jewish identification. They didn't assimilate. They wanted to remain a separate nation, a sense of loyalty, a sense of togetherness, an achdus. That was very important. That was the root of their redemption. We talked about that last week. The notion that I am a Jew. I rejoice in the joys of my people, and I suffer in the tragedies and sadness of my people. And that was the root of redemption. So that seems to be what they had. And yet, here's the problem. There is a counter medrash that seems to say exactly the opposite. It says that when Yosef died, the brothers made the following argument. Remember, the brothers survived Yosef. If we were so successful and so honored and so respected when we were living separate from the Egyptian culture in Goshen, how much more so will the Egyptians love us and admire us if we assimilate and become like the Egyptians? So the Medrash says, after Yosef died, there was a wholesale slide to be like the Egyptians. And that is why God made Pharaoh's heart hard and cruel. And he forgot all the good things that Yosef did to force the Jews to recognize that the more you want to be like the Goyim, the more the Goyim are going to reject you. You have a choice. You can decide to keep your identity on your own, or you can have that forced upon you. So the Beis Halevi says, which was it? I mean, on one hand, we are told they didn't assimilate, that they took pride in their separate identity. On the other hand, we're told they did assimilate. So the Beis Halevi said, that's exactly the point. When they were affluent, when they were successful, when they were accepted, they moved towards assimilation. It was slavery itself that gave them the sense that we're not going to be accepted. We have to care about each other. All we have is each other. So the slavery formed, in a very real sense, a group consciousness. Now, again, the Baruch Hashem, we're not in a slavery state in that sense. But I think things like, I don't want to be too political, but things like the UN resolution, was it 2 weeks ago? These things are very painful because nations that we regarded as our friends, of course I'm an American citizen myself, and our allies, and when they don't understand what we're going through, and they don't understand our situation, and they don't understand they imagine a moral equivalence between two sides here, which is simply just not objectively true. And that's a very, very painful thing. It's a sense of betrayal. It's a sense of our own friends don't care for us. But the positive thing there is that when a person realizes that they really cannot depend on the rest of the world. Yeah, we try to be friends, try to sanctify God's name, try to do good things, don't reject the world. But understand that ultimately, all you have are your people and your God. And nothing else is really going to be there for you in your ultimate time of distress. That could create, potentially, cohesiveness. Now, will it? I don't know. We like to fight here. But that could create unity, togetherness, precisely because we know we're not going to be able to get that acceptance out there. And that is what happened in Mitzrayim in a more drastic way. It was the Avdut that created the unity of not changing our language, not changing our culture, not intermarrying, not speaking Lashon Hara against each other, wearing distinctive Jewish clothing. The slavery actually engendered a certain pride of nationhood, understanding that we're never going to be accepted out there. And that's a hard thing, because again, I want to point out, Rav Soloveitchik pointed this out much earlier, when Avraham Avinu was negotiating for Marat HaMachpelah in Hebron. Right? So he starts off his speech by saying, Ger v'toshav, I am a stranger and I am a resident among you. And Rav Soloveitchik said those two words describe the Jew in the modern world. We are a toshav, we are a resident. We contribute to the world. We believe that we have a job to contribute to the world in science and technology, in wisdom, in helping nations that have famines or any natural disaster, whatever it is. We are toshav. We are actively involved in the world to make it better. And at the same time, there's a sense that we are strangers in the world. And these are contradictory emotions, but both of them coexist at the same time. And the Jew developed that sense of achdut when the Egyptians made them realize they're not really, in spite of everything that Yosef did for Mitzrayim. Yosef was the one who saved the Egyptian empire. But Paro didn't know. There came a Paro who did not know Yosef. And as Rashi points out, it doesn't mean he didn't know Yosef. Yosef was very well known. But, what have you done for me lately? Yeah, Yosef was a good guy, but, that's past already. What have you done for me now? So that's one idea in which the slavery itself fomented an achdut and a group consciousness. But there's another idea that I think is equally important that really moves almost in the opposite direction. There's a beautiful, beautiful pasuk in the Torah. When the Torah says, you shall love the ger. Now, ger means, of course, someone who converts to Judaism, but literally means a stranger. One without family, one without connections, one without clout or protexia. Look what the Torah says. You shall love the ger because you were gerim in the land of Egypt. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean you were converts in the land of Egypt. But it means the following. When a human being undergoes in their life painful experiences, they've been abused in different ways. Many types of spousal abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse of any sort. All the different things. And a person is finally out of that situation. There are different ways that people respond. It's a very difficult situation. Sometimes one response is, I've been hurt so much in my life that I build a protective shell around me to be sure that nobody's going to hurt me again. And their life is really devoted to not being hurt. Now, that is understandable. In other words, they want to distance themselves from great pain, and they're not going to allow anybody to hurt them. The Torah is suggesting a different approach. When you have been hurt, when you have been shamed, when you have been humiliated, don't distance yourself from that pain. Relive it. Remember it. And use that pain as the source of your empathy and compassion for others who were suffering. You knew what it was like to be a stranger. You knew what it was like to be the bottom person on the totem pole, without friends, without family, without economic support. You knew what it was like to be a nobody. When you see other people who on some level are coming to your society without connections, without family, they're bottom people on the totem pole, so to speak. You don't say, oh, forget about them, I'm on my high horse. You have to remember what it was like to be a nobody. And from that pain, you develop qualities of empathy and compassion for the outsider. Thus, it's no accident that even when Jews have wandered very far from the Torah, as many Jews had, there was always a notion of standing up for the downtrodden. Why were so many Jews involved in civil rights? Certainly in the United States and even in South Africa, fighting apartheid. Many languished in jail, along with Nelson Mandela, who perhaps didn't. Again, Mandela had many heroic aspects, although perhaps he was not as grateful to his Jewish compatriots as he should have been.
And a good reason also.
Again?
He may have had a good reason also.
Okay. Be it as it may, Mandela is a controversial person in many ways, but certainly there was certainly undeniably aspects of greatness in his struggle. That is why even when people are totally misguided, in some ways it comes from a good place. I live, Ma'alot Daphne, where I live, is right across the street from Highway 1, East Jerusalem, right? And for a number of years, there are demonstrations there by various Jewish people in favor of Palestinian rights or whatever it is, two-state solutions, one-state solution, whatever, to give up Jerusalem. And, these things are, to some degree, crazy, irresponsible. Again, I don't want to get into politics too much. But the one thing I will say is that even when Jews are misguided, and even when they're acting impulsively, they are acting out of a Yiddish neshama, a good heart. A heart that feels the pain of other people. A heart that understands that there is suffering on all sides. And yes, a lot of the suffering on the other side is self-imposed, to be sure. But we don't deny the reality of that. We don't deny that when people die, it is a tragedy, no matter what side people die. And that is really a gift of compassion, a gift of caring. And that is a gift that we got in a very difficult way. We got it through not being liberated from Egypt. We got it through collectively experiencing slavery. So the point that we're making here is that the notion that in order to express gratitude you got to begin with the bad is not simply that the bad makes me appreciate the good, but in a deeper way to understand that in the bad is in itself the seeds of a good. That it was the negative experience of slavery that gave us what is called a kinyan, the acquisition of midot, of rachamim, and compassion. Because we don't simply say, now that we're successful, forget about that pain. Rather, relive that pain. I'll just end with a story that I think illustrates this quite beautifully. Many of you might have heard of Yaakov Yosef Herman. Rabbi Scheinberg was a great Rosh Yeshiva, a great rabbi in Yerushalayim here. Pinchas Scheinberg, who was nifter a few years ago. His father-in-law was a man, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Herman, and Rabbi Herman's daughter, Rebbetzin Ruchama Sheh, of blessed memory, wrote a biography of her father called All for the Boss. Maybe you've seen the book. It's a very, very interesting book of all sorts of amazing stories. And there's a story she tells about her father that's quite beautiful story. He must have told it to her. Her father came to the United States as around 11 or 12-year-old boy with his parents, I think shortly after World War I. And the parents couldn't make a living here, so as strange as it sounds, they went back to Europe, and they left him to be alone in America as a 11 or 12, take care of himself. And they rented a room, and he had to pay, from whatever money he earned, he had to pay rent. As soon as the parents left, the landlord doubled the rent from $5 a week to $10 a week, or something like that. And he was not able, this boy was not able to pay. He could not pay the rent. He was evicted Erev Shabbos from that apartment. He spent that Shabbos, the first Shabbos without his parents in America, he spent it in Central Park. Now granted, in those days Central Park was safe. Actually, then it got dangerous later. Then Giuliani cleaned it up. So now it's actually relatively safe too. But you could imagine. He was cold. He was scared. All he had were two little challahs with him and a park bench. And because of the air problem, he couldn't even carry them around. He was like stuck there. And he was frightened. And what's going to happen after Shabbos? In those days anyway, if you were Shomer Shabbos, you worked from Monday to Friday. You didn't come in on Saturday. You had to look for a new job. What is he going to do? He's looking at his life, and there's no hope. There's just no way out of this. How is he going to survive? And when he prayed to God to help him, he asked Hashem for one thing. He says, Hashem, if you give me a parnasa, and if I grow up, and if I manage to get married, and have a family of my own, the one thing I ask you is, I should never forget what it's like to be cold and lonely and poor and scared. I want to remember it. I want to be connected to this feeling, so that when I see other people in the world that are cold and lonely and scared and poor, I will remember what it was like to be that, and I will feel empathy for them, and I will take care of them. And if you know the rest of the book, indeed, that's exactly what happened. He became a successful businessman, although he lost it in the Depression, but for a while at least, he was actually a very successful businessman until he eventually came to Eretz Yisrael. And in his home, he and his Rebbetzin often had hundreds of people for guests, and there were people who would sleep over for months at a time. And although he did have his share of great rabbis who would come to him, he also had many people that we would not appreciate as Shabbos guests. Homeless people, people who were mentally imbalanced, people who were sometimes even violent. They would throw, if they didn't like the cholent, they would just throw the plate, etc. And when people would say to him, how can you stand being with these crazies here? These are nuts. These are not crazy people. He said he knows what they're going through. He remembers what it was like. And he cannot turn anybody away. And this is the idea in which you look at your life and you take even the difficult, tragic, painful experiences, and you don't try to forget them, but you draw upon them because they are the source of your ability to feel for people and help people. And in that way, they are what we call the hidden gifts of Hashem. They're not such open gifts because they're very, very painful and very, very difficult. But in those difficulties are many, many hidden gifts. But because they're hidden, it's possible you throw them away without ever opening up and discovering the riches that they contain. And this is the inner meaning of why Yetziat Mitzrayim. I am grateful not only for the Yetzia from Mitzrayim, but even for the experience of Mitzrayim itself. So have a good week, and you take care.